Welcome to Every Cook Can Govern, the title of our film to be, and an idea popularized by an extraordinary man whose name was CLR James. I'm outside the WORLDwrite Centre in East London, where our volunteer crews aim to make a film to explain this Trinidad-born revolutionary's important place in history. In this taster, we aim to provide you the first glimpse of the story we're investigating, to introduce you to our crew and the global plans we have. CLR James was born in Trinidad, and to do justice to that part of the story, we aim to raise the funds to shoot there. We know that growing up under contemptuous British colonial rule on the vibrant island of Trinidad, awash with cricket talent, was bound to have an impact on this bright young man. Some of the great people who have already helped us, such as his former partner and wife, activist Selma James, Robert Hill, his literary executor, and author Selwyn Cudjoe, we hope to film to help us tell the story. For now, we'll just explore CLR James' arrival ourselves and his first 6 years in the UK. He did so much, it's hard to keep up. It was in the spring of 1932 that CLR James landed in Britain and lived his first 3 months here in Bloomsbury, London. But this was a London far removed from the multicultural city we see today. In fact, it is estimated that there were only around 10,000 black people living in Britain in the 1930s. Back then, being a colonial subject in Imperial Britain, you would have been regarded at best as a curiosity and certainly ignorant.
However, it was James's intellect and eloquence that easily defied the colonial stereotypes that many imagined to be true. It was here in Russell Square, where the Student Movement building used to be, that James recounts an amusing story of attending a reading by the poet and critic Edith Sitwell. During his first few weeks in London, James wrote a series of essays on his first impressions for the Trinidad public, which were published in the Port of Spain Gazette. In the essay on a meeting with Sitwell, James suggests he surprised her with his voluminous knowledge of poetry and literature and the literary movers and shakers of the day.
James, of course, knew that Britain's colonial rulers saw their subjects in the colonies as inferior and incapable of ruling themselves.
In the film, we'll look further at the backward ideas of the British colonial elite and James's response. But for now, let's find out more of what James was up to in Bloomsbury. James was only in London briefly before moving up north to Nelson in Lancashire, where working-class life and politics were to have a profound impact, not least his reading of Trotsky's History of the Russian Revolution. We plan to shoot in Nelson too and find out what made this talented black intellectual and cricket reporter become part of an important but minority Trotskyist movement in 1930s Britain. We aim to interview James' scholar and activist, Christian Hogsberg, whose research is phenomenal and has informed this taster. We also hope to interview CLR James' fan and Oxford lecturer, Alan Hudson, who grew up in Nelson, to fill us in. To know more on James and Nelson, you'll have to wait for the film. Meanwhile, I'm standing outside what used to be the location of Agri House, number 47 Doughty Street. It was a hostel set up by the League of Coloured Peoples in 1934, of which James was a member for a while.
James, along with members of the West African Student Union, discovered that Agri House, a supposedly progressive institution, was being in fact financed by the British Colonial Office to keep an eye on potentially uppity students from the colonies. James, along with members of the West African Student Union, called for a boycott of Agri House by all students of African descent in London. In this pamphlet, they denounced collaboration with the Colonial Office and its attempts to control African students in Britain in the same way that it controlled Africans in the colonies.
For our film too, we plan to interview writer Dan Whittle and British Library curator Dr. Philip Hadfield to further uncover what London was like in the 1930s, how an immigrant like CLR James would have been received, and what the Colonial Office was up to. But for now, let's move on.
In 1933, CLR James lived here in a flat at number 9 Heathcote Street for several years. It's now a new block of flats, but this picture shows us what the street was like. Louise Cripps, a beautiful married woman and activist who James had a relationship with in the 30s, described the flat as pretty basic and dusty, with a gas coin meter and aging decor. She wrote, There were no pictures on the walls and not much furniture, but she says there were books everywhere, books up on the walls, books on the floor, books and papers on the table.
At this point, we must mention too that James had left Britain to spend 6 months in France to research his planned book on the Haitian slave revolts. While he was there, the British Labour Party had published a report on colonial policy which ruled out self-government for what they referred to as the primitive communities of Africa. When James returned here from France in early 1934, he broke with what he considered useless, respectable politics for good. Along with his Trotskyist comrades, he joined the Finchley Independent Labour Party.
James quickly became a leader of the Trotskyists within the ILP, and it was here in his flat on Heathcote Street that they held their branch meetings. These meetings were attended by people who were to become leading political figures themselves, like Balkrishna Gupta and the young Indian law student Ajit Roy. I had rarely come across a finer political polemicist than CLR James, said Roy, who had been a member of the Communist Party. He recalled, his attacks on Stalinism were absolutely devastating. When Leon Trotsky was put on trial in Russia by Stalin, James recalls making it a habit to wreck Stalinist meetings in London. Armed with material to demonstrate the lies the Soviet bureaucracy were telling, he recounted, he was able to be most effective.
In the midst of frenetic campaigning work too, in the winter of 1936, here in his small cramped flat in Heathcote Street, James also wrote World Revolution, the Rise and Fall of the Communist International. It's hard to read this tome today, as the world is so different and politics so bland, but at the time it provided a much needed overview of the deadly political impact of Stalinism across the globe. And in Britain, the fight between Trotskyist and Communist Party members became vicious. But you'll have to wait for the film for more on that.
And James was not the only West Indian arrival to make an impact. It was here on Gray's Inn Road that James attended a political meeting to find to his surprise that the speaker, George Padmore, was in fact his childhood friend Malcolm Nurse. This was a time when Gray's Inn Road had become, in the words of 30s writer and New Statesman satirist Reginald Reynolds, home to the headquarters of a whole network of satellite organizations in the communist solar system.
Just here, at number 53 Gray's Inn Road, was the International Centre of the League Against Imperialism. This newsagent at 94 Gray's Inn Road was where George Padmore and CLR James established the International African Service Bureau, a pan-African organisation committed to taking on British imperialism and a forerunner to the anti-colonial pan-African movements of the 50s and 60s.
Here is the Honourable Society of Gray's Inn, a professional association for judges and barristers in London. Kwame Nkrumah, who led Ghana to independence, was admitted as a law student in 1946. James not only supported Nkrumah for a while, but wrote a great book on the Ghana Revolution, and we hope to shoot in Ghana too.
It's hard for us to imagine what political life was like in this period, and what the 24/7 political activity of a revolutionary entailed. It was during his first 6 years in Britain from 1932 to 1938 that CLR James swiftly became a renowned one. It's important to understand the context too. It wasn't just some abstract theory or set of ideas that CLR James had picked up, but the force of events that drove him and shaped his politics. Mussolini's invasion of Ethiopia, the rise of fascism and failure of working class movements in Germany, the nationalist road taken by the communist parties under Moscow's direction, and the anti-colonial stirrings. This context is something we aim to spell out in the film. But back to this area. About a mile up the road in Red Lion Square, James picked up some of the books and pamphlets that were to shape his ideas and understanding of events. Another of our presenters, Lauren, is there for us now.
It was here, in this serene, leafy part of Holborn, that CLR James discovered a resource that would help refine his political analysis. Before it was bombed in World War II, in roughly this area, at 68 Red Lion Square, stood the Progressive Bookstore, which housed radical left-wing literature. Over here, on the corner of Red Lion Square, stands Conway Hall, home to numerous political meetings throughout the course of its history. In the mid-1930s, it served as a public meeting place for CLR James and the political movements he was a key part of. In 1935, James formed the International African Friends of Abyssinia, the IAFA, with George Padmore and Amy Ashwood Garvey, former wife of Marcus Garvey, along with a host of well-regarded thinkers. It was here, in Conway Hall, that these influential activists came together to hold their third meeting to challenge Italian fascism's occupation of Ethiopia. Few did more than James to rally solidarity with the Ethiopians, and on the speaking tours he undertook to oppose the war, he is widely remembered as a great orator and for the searing articles he wrote in the ILP's New Leader. James attacked the League of Nations, a forerunner to the UN, which, dominated by Great Britain and France, had already carved up most of Africa between its members. The idea of looking to their help against Mussolini, he argued, was not only useless, but dangerous. He wrote in the New Leader that to call for action by the League of Nations, to come within the orbit of imperialist politics, is to be debilitated by the stench, to be drowned in the morass of lies and hypocrisy. James urged an alternative strategy of international industrial action to stop Mussolini's war machine. James even considered going to Ethiopia to fight the war himself, but was persuaded it was more important to challenge the war from here, within Britain's imperialist heartland. Within a year, the British left were forming the international brigades to take on the fascists in Spain, but unlike James, they had no thoughts of fighting imperialism in Africa. Some activists, however, joined the IAFA, the International African Friends of Abyssinia. In 1937, it was this group which rebranded themselves the International African Service Bureau to direct their efforts against British imperialism. In fact, Conway Hall was the chosen meeting place for the anti-colonial exhibition they organised to coincide with Empire Day. James's activities and writings were phenomenal during this first 6 years in Britain, but to find out more, we have to head across London.
CLR James is probably most well known for his classic book, The Black Jacobins, a history of the Haitian Revolution of 1791 to 1804, and its first outing in the public arena was not in a book, but as a play. This building behind me is St James's Theatre, where Westminster Theatre once stood. It was here on the 15th and 16th of March 1936 that CLR James's play, Toussaint Louverture, the story of the only successful slave revolt in history, was performed. Starring the famous radical performer and activist Paul Robeson in the lead role, it was a significant moment, the first time black professional actors starred on the British stage in a play written by a black playwright. But the play wasn't merely meant as entertainment, nor was it simply a historical reconstruction. Nor for James, as we shall see in the film, was the colour of your skin ultimately the most important thing about anyone. James was making a key political point. Revolution was possible, and in the audience it thought that Jomo Kenyatta and Derek Williams, future independence leaders of Kenya and Trinidad, quietly taking notes.
Welcome back to the WORLDwrite Centre and the rain. We hope we've whet your appetite. CLR James died in Brixton in May 1989. For the major documentary we are planning, as well as the key figures we have mentioned, we also aim to interview some great people who knew him, like Mike Dibb, who filmed him, Yvonne Brewster, who staged his play, and Margaret Busby, who published his works. We'll tell you all about some of his seminal works, especially Black Jacobins, Beyond the Boundary, and Mariners, Renegades and Castaways, with help from the Museum of London Docklands, who staged a CLR James readathon for us, the British Library, who helped us access first editions, and from key authors like Andy Smith, Kenan Malik, and more, we aim to portray his life and significance. We have a lot to do and are grateful for the support we have received from the Heritage Lottery Fund, as Wesley Kerr explained at our project launch at the historic Oval. But that's only the start, and we have no funds to film outside the UK or to pay for the archive material we need, so we need your help. Our doors are always open to everyone who would like to be involved in this project. Indeed, with the right resources, we believe every cook can film too. We look forward to hearing from you.